Michael, good morning to you.
Yeah, kia ora, Pat.
Kia ora. Ignore any of those emails that went backwards and forwards that went, oh, we missed a window. Maybe we'll do it tomorrow. So we're here now and we're talking. And as I just said, I saw you smiling and laughing as I was talking, going, this is the internet. We don't have an ad break to hit. We can just take a breath. We don't have to rush. As long as you're okay for a bit of a chat, we don't have to rush.
Yeah, no, it's always good to talk.
The big announcement yesterday about the mandates coming off April 5th, pretty much, basically. Really keen to get your thoughts on that decision.
Yeah, well, I think some of this was an inevitable change, and we know that there's a lot of pressure to adjust our response in relation to the fact that the Omicron variant is obviously less severe than the Delta variant. We are highly vaccinated now, and I think obviously there's a degree of fatigue and even resistance to the response after 2 years. And it is very harsh, as we know, for some groups, some sectors, hospitality, tourism, and so on. It's always important to remember, though, that even if New Zealand changes its settings, it doesn't transport us back magically to the pre-pandemic era. A lot of the problems are global problems now, and we can't sort of magically return to that environment. The other thing is that many people also respond to the level of threat as they perceive it, and this is in terms of going back out to hospitality venues and so on. Yeah. And the other reality is that actually the risk of getting this virus has never been higher than it is at the moment in New Zealand. I mean, transmission, particularly in the South Island, as you know, is just increasing at the moment, or I think it's actually peaking, whereas it peaked in Auckland a couple of weeks ago. So there's a lot of virus in New Zealand, and many people will be, taking precautions against getting infected.
Yeah, maybe, George, if you can hear me, maybe we'll put some of the data up. But I was surprised. I think I read in the New Zealand Herald this morning, I was surprised at the number of cases in southern DHB versus what was around the rest of the country. Southern DHB, of course, for people who aren't aware, are sort of Oamaru across to Queenstown, down Dunedin, Invercargill, that sort of area. And it really surprised me. I think maybe Auckland still had more, but comparative population, it looked like perhaps Southern at the moment is the per capita, maybe one of the hardest hit areas for new infections. Am I reading that data correctly?
Yeah, and one of the things is, of course, we get bombarded with numbers, but actually, as an epidemiologist, you're always more concerned about rates because that's a measure of risk. So the population, Auckland always looks dominant because, there's 1.6 million people there, and of course they'll have lots of cases, but their rate now, their case numbers are falling, but also their rate is now much less than the South Island.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's important, isn't it? It's a little bit like when we hear the opposing forces, Michael, the dark side, come out talking about, there's more people with the vaccine who are in hospital than without. But when you go, yeah, but 96% of the people in hospital making up, 50% of the cases, or even 60% of the cases, whereas 3% of the population making up 30% of the cases. But the number per capita of vaccinated versus unvaccinated, it says to me as an idiot sitting in Dunedin that the vaccinated status is still by far and away the safest status for both infection and hospitalization.
Yeah, look, we're in such a good position having these tools. They make an enormous difference. I would say at the moment there's two gaps in vaccination that concern me. One is that we've got almost 1 million New Zealanders who haven't had a booster. And at the very least, a booster saves you from getting a really miserable illness. I don't know if you've talked to people who've got this infection or had it recently. Some of them say it is really the sickest they've ever felt. They haven't quite gone to hospital, but you want to avoid this. And considering how quick and easy it is to do that, I'm still amazed that not everyone is taking advantage of this free vaccine. The other gap I'm worried about is that only about half of our school-age kids have been vaccinated.
Right.
And that worries me because of long COVID particularly. I mean, young kids their immune systems are tough and they will generally do very well with this infection. They do go to hospital sometimes, they very rarely die. But there is the problem of long COVID. We don't think that age protects you from this. This is obviously the long tail of infection that affects many body systems, the brain, the heart, and other systems. And you really don't want to get this chronic fatigue type syndrome. And it is very avoidable because the good news is that the evidence shows that vaccination protects you from this very well. So it's just another good reason to get vaccinated. And I'm, again, very surprised that all parents aren't rushing off to vaccinate their kids. And this is only my own personal experience. They've still got an 11-year-old at home who fortunately loved the idea of getting vaccinated and is begging to get vaccinated and has had a second shot now. But she is saying that, some of her friends at school haven't been vaccinated. And I'm just really concerned for their well-being. And we have made sure that she goes off to school every day with a high-performing N95 style mask.
Yep.
But the standards in schools are not great. I mean, these masks cost more, and most of the kids are running around with little disposable surgical masks or fabric masks, which are really not good enough now with Omicron.
Yeah. I've got a beautiful kind of creative brain, Michael. And when people are talking, I start to, not that I drift away from the conversation, but I start to think about where that could go. And as you were talking about the peaks and about where we're at, I had this picture in my head of the protests at Wellington and the people that were there. You're in Wellington. And I just wondered if you were on Wellington grounds during that protest. And that prompted me to think, how are you doing at the moment? Have you had any instances where you felt unsafe? How have you been because obviously you're one of the faces of this, and there is, what I would think to be a ridiculous pushback at the moment from unscientific, conspiracy theorists. But how have you been during this? Have you been in any situations where you've kind of felt unsafe physically or anything?
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't felt really endangered, but the pushback on social media, some of it is really disturbing. And there is a disinformation project where academics are tracking some of the information that appears on various platforms. And some of it is really horrible. And basically, it's there's degrees of awfulness, but some of it basically dehumanizes you. Some of it then talks about performing violent acts on you. It doesn't quite get to the stage of saying what, when, and where, like organizing something, but it's every step up to that. And I know I'm not alone in this regard. And so that is regularly monitored, and it's the people doing the monitoring report every day to the police about the contents. And of course, Telegram is one of the main sites where a lot of these groups are hosted, because it's an unmoderated website. It's interesting. It was started by a couple of Russians a few years ago. You probably know the background to it, but it's interesting to see that for the Ukraine struggle, it's one of the main sites they're using to get information out. So I guess it's just like the internet in some ways this is a particular platform that's relatively agnostic about content. But in New Zealand, it is hosting, far right, neo-Nazis and anti-vaccine groups, Voices for Freedom and all the rest, that produce absolute streams of what I would say is complete rubbish and disinformation, misinformation. A lot of it's generated by commercial interests, the natural foods industry or natural remedies industry internationally, that's trying to drive people away from science-based approaches to say, go more with your feeling and go more with, don't ignore the science, basically follow us. And so it's got a big commercial drivers as well. But I think it's unfortunately, some of the consequences are, I think, have been very rough for vulnerable people.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, we've got people watching live at the moment. There are a couple of people who have asked a few questions, and I like some of their questions. Are we okay to? I've got a couple more for you, but the reason I'm asking is if you're okay to take a couple of questions from people watching, then what I'll say to people is, if you're watching and you want to ask Professor Michael Baker a question, put it in the comments. Obviously, all my viewers are respectful, Michael. That'll be fine. They're all love. I have no cocks watching this. They're all lovely people. But if you want to ask Professor Baker a question, and I think it either hasn't been asked or it's worth asking. Then chuck it in the comments. Couple of things. The announcement that was made yesterday about the vaccine passes. There has been a response from academics and learned people kind of across the board. We talked about this a bit earlier this morning. Professor Michael Planck at Christchurch said basically it sounds like it's time. One of the modelers, who was Dr. Emily Harvey, was concerned about the inside numbers going up, and Dr. Susie Wiles says removing vaccine mandates for people working with our children who can't yet be vaccinated makes me nervous. Susie went on to say that places internationally, I'm paraphrasing, who reduced the vaccine mandates too soon are experiencing another wave. The first thing I wanted to ask you is, do you think that the decision that was made yesterday is more driven by public health advice or public pressure and populism? And because I thought it was perhaps a couple of weeks too early, but I'd be interested to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with those concerns, and I've done a few interviews where I've talked about the problems. I mean, one thing is that I think obviously the timing is wrong. I mean, the time to relax anything is when you've well out of the intense pandemic wave, where some of the changes are happening from this Friday, when virus transmission's never really been higher in New Zealand. So I think that's a bad decision, and I think it must be partly driven by politics. Whereas if we wait till, I would say, May, we would see the country coming out of its pandemic wave and settling at this new, fairly high baseline level. The second thing is, I think some of the controls aren't, we need criteria-based approaches here. So the controls need to be based on best evidence. So we should only be doing things that actually work. Secondly, I think they need to be proportionate to the problem they're trying to fix. And so that would mean that some tools, I think, could be retired but kept in our back pocket. The obvious one is QR scanning to support contact tracing. We're just not using it. So we shouldn't burden people with this. And but keep the app on your phone in case we need it in the future. The other, I'm really concerned about vaccine passes, because these are no longer particularly effective. And the reason is that they needed to be adjusted for, they were developed for Delta. 2 doses of vaccine worked very well. Omicron, we know we need 3. There are technical problems of updating this because of the way the passes are issued. But that tool really needed to be updated. And I think it still had a role in some settings. The setting that worries me most is a whole bunch of people. We all love going out socializing. You're indoors, even with up to 100 people. And if food and drink is served, of course, you take your mask off.
Sure.
And if you just got your vaccine pass, well, you still can be very easily infected with Omicron and infect everyone around you. So I just felt that the tools were not really working very well for their intended purpose. And I think that was something that could have been fixed. So in a way, removing those requirements will have not a huge impact, because most people are vaccinated now, and it really needed to have the next step up of requiring a booster. So it's a mixed bag really at the moment.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying, and not that we have to get into this because we've got one other question, then a few questions coming in from people, is maybe I'm just going to bring up a page of search engines of the vaccine pass. Maybe if you had to get boosted, that vaccine pass, which is grey, would have been green or something. So it would have even given more. Is that sort of what you're saying? There could have been a better way to identify vaccinated people from boosted people?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I said that at the start. I thought that was interesting. On the boosted, you were talking about being protected, after the boost. I saw a Facebook post. Sorry, I know it's the scientific take from Facebook, but I saw a Facebook post the other day from a colleague of mine who said something like they'd gotten their 4th booster or their 4th shot. And I follow this obviously super closely. And I thought, what? Even I, someone who follows it quite closely is like, hang on, what? 4th booster or 4th shot? What's because we're talking about being boosted to protect you. Is there advice coming out now, or is there a bit of a swing towards boosting again?
Yeah, well, some people are already having their 4th dose anyway, and that's and in fact the terminology starts to get a bit confusing, because quite early on people who had immune suppressive illness were advised to get a 3rd dose, and then get their booster as well. And that was because the immune system, I mean, after all, the vaccine doesn't give you immunity on its own. It stimulates your immune system to give you immunity. So if your immune system is impaired for various reasons, and partly increasing age, so immune senescence, but also underlying illness, you won't get a great response. And so you may need to give that response everything you can to stimulate it. So that's quite common now, and that some people have had a fourth dose. And whether you call that a boost or just reboosting your system, the terminology is a bit ambiguous.
Okay. Look, I know you've been with us for much longer than you said you were going to be because we had a bit of a later start. Are you okay for a couple more minutes, or do you need to go? Because we could wrap it now. You're okay?
Yeah.
Okay, let's get to just a couple of these questions then. Crazy Old World says, Michael, where, and this was sort of one of my questions that was going to be as well, but where do you see New Zealand being in 12 months' time?
Yeah, well, the unpredictable, or the wild card in all of this, is the virus, as we know. And there's two ways it evolves. One is by sort of, you say, drift. The virus drifts along, and in general, it gradually improves what it does, which is just become more transmissible or better at evading the immune system. But then occasionally it's capable of what's called shift, where it has a dramatic change. And this is where you get a process where it can pick up a whole lot of RNA from a different virus, and that's when you get a Delta or an Omicron or another Greek letter appears. And the way the virus will beat its successors in the evolutionary arms race is by evading our immunity. So we need to plan for what could be a big shift. This may produce a virus that's more or less dangerous. That's not certain. So that's the big unknown. Now, if that doesn't happen, and Omicron, after all, is a very fit virus, it's very infectious. It's going to beat off all comers at the moment. If that's still the virus we're dealing with, then I think we'll be in a reasonably good situation. We will be working out more about what immunization schedule is useful. I think probably we should bargain on maybe an annual COVID-19 jab along with our flu vaccine, which is still very important.
Yep.
And we will be better able to manage the most vulnerable in New Zealand. And that's my big hope. And life will be getting back to a much closer resemblance to normal at that point.
Okay. Gareth also says, rat tests seem to be hit and miss, almost completely unreliable according to some. Michael's thoughts. Got any thoughts around that, about rat tests and how accurate they are, Michael?
Yeah. Well, they are quite limited. I mean, they're not perfect tests, as I think everyone knows. I mean, the thing is, because they're often self-administered. Not all of us are very used to poking a swab up our noses and even pointing it in the right spot. And so that's a big problem. And they're less reliable or less valid or sensitive when they're self-administered. So one thing is to maybe get someone else to actually do the swabbing for you, and really following the instructions, poking it into your nose rather than up your nose, among other things. Follow the instructions. The other thing is the sensitivity is quite low early in illness, so you often need to test yourself 2 or 3 times, and maybe at 2-day intervals when you're getting symptoms. That improves the sensitivity. If you're really still sick and you really want to know, you can still go and get a PCR test.
Right. Oh, that's a good idea. So if you're unconvinced of your results, go and get a PCR. That would be the advice. Nathan says, now I don't know the person, Dr. Paul Offit, but maybe you do. Hi, Michael. Do you agree with Dr. Paul Offit that natural infection should count as 1 dose of vaccine? So I guess for other people watching, what he's saying is, when you get an infection and you get over it, you have the antibodies. Although, let's be clear, I've heard people talk about immunity because I've got it. Your antibodies still wane between 3 and 6 months. So is what he's saying, with that waning, much like the vaccine wanes, could it be counted as 1 dose of vaccine?
Yeah, look, I think that's probably a reasonable metaphor. I mean, people talk about hybrid immunity being quite good. That's a combination of getting vaccinated and then encountering the virus, which a lot of people will experience. And now people, particularly those who are boosted, may get the virus and may feel a little bit unwell and then bounce back. and it may be because they have actually been exposed to it. There's evidence that that kind of hybrid immunity is probably quite strong. We still don't know. I mean, antibody immunity does wane, but other forms of immunity, particularly the cell-based cellular immunity, does appear to be more long-lived.
Yeah.
And it will be years before we know fully, because it's just a new virus, and the vaccines are relatively new, and everything we're doing it's a new territory. So anything that relates to long-term questions inevitably will take time to answer those questions.
Very good. Hey, look, Michael, thank you for giving us some extra time this morning. I know that at the start we didn't quite connect at the start, but you were gracious enough to stick with us through the second part of the show, so we appreciate that. Got to answer some of the people's questions directly, and yeah, I'm sure we'll talk to you again sometime soon, but thank you for giving us some time today. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, great to talk, Pat. Thanks for having me.